The fastest way to embarrass yourself is to underestimate the quietest person in the room. On a cold Friday night in Norfolk, Virginia, the Harbor Line bar was packed shoulder to shoulder with locals, off-duty military personnel, and tourists escaping the wind blowing in from the Chesapeake Bay. Country music drifted through the speakers. Glasses clinked. Laughter rolled across the room. Near the center of the bar sat a group of Navy SEALs enjoying a rare evening off after weeks of training. They were loud, confident, and impossible to miss. Most people gave them space. Most people admired them. Then the front door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She looked completely ordinary. Mid-30s. White. Long brown hair pulled back neatly. Faded denim jacket. Simple jeans. No jewelry except for a thin silver chain barely visible beneath her collar. She carried no purse, no shopping bags, nothing that would attract attention. Her name was Evelyn Hart. And within 10 seconds, she had already noticed something nobody else in the bar had. Instead of choosing one of the empty stools near the television screens, she walked toward the far corner and selected a seat with a clear view of the entrance, the emergency exit, and nearly every table in the room. The bartender noticed. So did one of the SEALs. "That's a strange place to sit," he joked. His friends glanced over. Evelyn simply ordered water. No alcohol. No small talk. No reaction. The group chuckled and returned to their conversation. A few minutes later, one of the younger operators looked back toward her. "You here waiting for somebody?" he called. Evelyn smiled politely. "Just enjoying a quiet evening." The answer only encouraged more teasing. "Wrong place for that," another said. Laughter followed. Evelyn remained calm. She watched the room the same way other people watched a football game. Her eyes moved from table to table. Door to door. Reflection to reflection. Not nervously. Methodically. Almost professionally. Nobody noticed except an older man seated alone near the jukebox. He watched her for several seconds before returning to his drink. 20 minutes passed. The noise inside the bar grew louder. A college game flashed across the televisions overhead. Servers moved between crowded tables carrying trays of food. Through it all, Evelyn remained exactly the same. Relaxed. Alert. Unbothered. Then one of the SEALs raised his glass and pointed toward her. "You know what?" he laughed. "She's probably the safest person in here. Nobody's picking her for any dangerous job." More laughter erupted. Another operator grinned. "Yeah. Useless, lady. That's your official call sign tonight." The table roared. Around them, several customers smiled at the joke. Evelyn looked up briefly. There was no anger in her face. No embarrassment. No attempt to defend herself. She simply nodded once and returned her attention to the room. That calm reaction should have ended the conversation. Instead, it made the older man near the jukebox stare a little longer. Because he had seen that expression before. Years ago. In people who never needed to prove anything. The older man did not look away this time. He set his glass down slowly and studied Evelyn from across the room. Most people would have missed the details. The relaxed shoulders. The steady breathing. The way she never seemed surprised by anything happening around her. But he noticed. Years earlier, he had seen the same quiet awareness in men and women whose jobs required them to stay calm when everyone else lost control. Meanwhile, the group at the center of the bar continued enjoying themselves. The teasing had already become yesterday's joke in their minds. They were talking football, training schedules, and weekend plans. Evelyn remained in her corner, drinking water and occasionally glancing toward the entrance whenever the door opened. Outside, the weather had begun to change. Wind rattled the windows. A light rain tapped against the glass. Most customers never noticed. Evelyn did. She seemed to notice everything. A server accidentally dropped a fork near the kitchen entrance. Evelyn looked up before the sound fully echoed across the room. Someone entered through the front door carrying a wet jacket. Evelyn's eyes briefly followed the movement before returning to the room. Nothing about her behavior appeared dramatic. In fact, it was so subtle that most people ignored it completely. Then something unusual happened. The music stopped for a moment. It was only a technical glitch lasting a few seconds, but nearly everyone looked toward the speakers. Everyone except Evelyn. She was watching the entrance. The older man near the jukebox frowned. That was when he became certain she was not simply passing time. She was observing patterns. Watching people. Measuring the room. Across the bar, one of the younger operators finally noticed her again. "I think she has been sitting in the exact same position for an hour," he joked. Another laughed. "Maybe she is writing a secret report about us." More chuckles followed. Evelyn simply smiled politely. There was no irritation in her expression. If anything, she seemed amused by how little they understood about her. The older man found himself wondering the same thing. Who was she really? Then the front door opened again. A tall man stepped inside wearing a dark rain-soaked jacket. Nothing about him seemed especially remarkable. Yet something changed almost instantly. Evelyn noticed him before anyone else. Her eyes lifted. Her posture remained relaxed, but her attention sharpened. The older man saw it happen. It lasted less than a second. The newcomer paused near the entrance and slowly scanned the room. Most customers returned to their conversations. Evelyn did not. Neither did the older man. A strange feeling settled over the bar. Nothing dangerous. Nothing obvious. Just a subtle shift that was difficult to explain. The newcomer eventually walked toward the far side of the room and disappeared into the crowd. The moment passed. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked again. But the older man could not shake the feeling that Evelyn had recognized something important. And whatever she had noticed, he suspected the rest of the room was about to find out far too late. The uneasy feeling lingered in the Harbor Line bar long after the newcomer disappeared into the crowd. Nobody could explain why. The televisions were still playing. Drinks were still being served. Conversations continued. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different. Evelyn Hart remained seated in the same corner, her glass untouched for several minutes. Her attention never seemed fixed on any one person, yet somehow she appeared aware of everything happening around her. The older man near the jukebox noticed another detail. Every few minutes, her eyes returned to the same section of the room where the rain-soaked stranger had gone. Not staring. Not tracking. Simply checking. Confirming. As if she were quietly solving a puzzle nobody else knew existed. Across the room, the group of operators had shifted into another conversation. One of them was telling a story from a training exercise. Another was laughing about a challenge course completed earlier that month. They were relaxed, confident, and enjoying the rare freedom that came with a night off. Then one of the younger men noticed the newcomer standing near the pool tables. "That guy has been watching us for 10 minutes, he said casually. A teammate glanced over his shoulder. "Probably recognizes who we are." The explanation sounded reasonable enough. The conversation moved on. But Evelyn had already noticed something else. The stranger was not watching the operators. He was watching the exits. The same exits she had been monitoring since she arrived. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows. A gust of wind rattled the front door. Several customers entered, shaking water from their jackets before finding seats. The bar grew even more crowded. More noise. More movement. More distractions. Exactly the kind of environment where important details became easy to miss. The bartender suddenly frowned. A tab near the register was missing. A customer insisted he had already paid. Another claimed he had not. It was a small disagreement. Nothing serious. Yet while several people focused on the discussion, Evelyn quietly looked toward the rear hallway leading to the storage area. The older man followed her gaze. He did not know why. He only knew she seemed to notice things before anyone else. A few moments later, the stranger near the pool tables casually changed positions and moved closer to that same hallway. Nobody reacted. Nobody except Evelyn. She slowly set her glass down. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Just enough for the older man to notice. For the first time all evening, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He had spent years around military personnel. Years around law enforcement. Years around people trained to recognize problems before they happened. And Evelyn reminded him of every one of them. Then one of the operators laughed and pointed toward her again. She has not moved all night. The others smiled. But before anyone could continue the joke, the older man quietly spoke for the first time. "Trust me," he said without taking his eyes off Evelyn, "if she is paying attention, there is probably a reason." The table fell silent for a moment. Not because they believed him. Because they suddenly realized he sounded completely serious. The operators exchanged uncertain glances after the older man's comment. Nobody laughed this time. The confidence that had filled their table only minutes earlier had been replaced by curiosity. One of them finally turned toward the older man. "You know her?" he asked. The man shook his head slowly. "No. But I know what experience looks like." Before anyone could ask another question, movement near the rear hallway drew attention away from the conversation. The rain-soaked stranger had changed positions again. He was no longer standing near the pool tables. Now he was speaking quietly with another man who had entered only a few minutes earlier. Neither seemed interested in the game on the televisions. Neither appeared interested in food or drinks. They kept scanning the room in short, careful glances. Most customers never noticed. Evelyn did. She remained seated, but something subtle changed. Her eyes moved between the two men only once before returning to her water glass. The older man noticed it immediately. Across the room, one of the operators noticed it too. "What is she looking at?" he asked. Nobody answered. The bartender suddenly emerged from the office behind the register. He looked frustrated. Another receipt had disappeared from the counter. A customer claimed a wallet was missing. Someone else insisted a jacket had been moved. None of the problems were serious by themselves, but together they created an unusual pattern. Small disturbances. Small distractions. The kind people ignored because each one seemed harmless. Evelyn slowly glanced toward the front entrance. The rain outside had intensified. Through the window she could see reflections moving across the wet pavement. For a brief moment, her expression hardened. Then it vanished. The older man leaned forward. Something had finally caught her attention. One of the operators stood from the table and approached her corner. His friends watched with amused curiosity. "All right," he said with a grin. "I have to ask. What is so interesting about this room?" Evelyn looked up. "Nothing." The operator laughed. "You have been watching everybody for almost 2 hours." "Observation is a habit," she replied calmly. "That sounds mysterious." "Not really." Her answer was simple, but the operator noticed something unusual. She never seemed defensive. She never tried to impress anyone. She spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need validation. Before he could continue, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the bar. Several people turned toward the sound. A chair had tipped over near the rear hallway. One of the strangers quickly apologized and helped set it upright. The explanation seemed reasonable. The room relaxed again. Everyone except Evelyn. Her eyes remained fixed on the hallway for 1 second longer than necessary. Then she looked toward the operator standing beside her. "You should probably return to your friends," she said. "Why?" he asked. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the front door where another unfamiliar figure had just entered from the storm. Because, she replied quietly, I think something is about to happen, and your table is not paying attention to the right people. The operator stared at Evelyn for a moment, unsure whether she was joking. Her expression gave him nothing. No fear. No urgency. Just certainty. That alone was enough to make him uncomfortable. He glanced back toward his teammates. They were still talking, still laughing, completely unaware of the subtle tension that had settled over the room. You really think something is wrong? He asked quietly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the front entrance where the newest arrival had stopped near the window. The man was pretending to watch the game on television, but every few seconds his eyes drifted elsewhere. Not to the players. Not to the score. To the people. To the exits. To the staff. The same pattern she had noticed earlier. The operator followed her gaze. For the first time all night, he stopped seeing random strangers and started seeing details. The unusual positioning. The repeated glances. The quiet coordination that seemed almost invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. Maybe it is nothing, Evelyn said calmly. But maybe it is not. The operator returned to his table, though he found it impossible to relax. Across the room, the older man near the jukebox noticed the change immediately. The young operator was no longer smiling. He was watching. Learning. Seeing the room differently. A few minutes later, another strange thing happened. The bartender reached for the telephone behind the counter, frowned, and tried again. Nothing. He checked the connection and shook his head. The line appeared dead. Most customers never noticed. Evelyn did. The older man did too. Outside, rain continued falling steadily. Water streaked across the windows, turning the lights from passing cars into blurred ribbons of color. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier by the minute. One of the operators finally stood and walked toward the bartender. A brief conversation followed. Then he returned with a puzzled expression. Phone line is out, he told the others. Probably the storm. It sounded reasonable. Yet nobody at the table seemed fully convinced. Their attention kept drifting toward Evelyn. She remained exactly where she had been all evening. Calm. Silent. Observing. Then the moment arrived. Not a dramatic event. Not a loud disturbance. Something much smaller. One of the strangers near the rear hallway accidentally bumped into another customer. An apology followed. Smiles were exchanged. The situation appeared harmless. Yet Evelyn stood up. For the first time in nearly 3 hours, she left her chair. The movement was so simple that most people barely noticed. But every operator at the table noticed immediately. So did the older man. Evelyn walked only a few feet before stopping. Her eyes moved once across the room. Entrance. Hallway. Window. Counter. Then she quietly turned toward the bartender. Lock the office door, she said. The bartender blinked. Why? Evelyn looked toward the strangers. Because the people causing the distractions are not interested in your customers. The room suddenly felt very quiet. They are interested in something else. And for the first time that night, several people realized she had known it long before anyone else did. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The bartender stared at Evelyn as if trying to decide whether she was serious. The operators exchanged glances. The strangers near the hallway continued acting completely normal. That was what made the situation so unsettling. Nothing looked wrong. Yet the confidence in Evelyn's voice made it impossible to dismiss her warning. What exactly do you think they want? The bartender asked quietly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the room one more time. Then she pointed toward the office behind the counter. Payroll records. Cash storage. Security access. Maybe something else. The target does not matter. Then what matters? Asked the older man near the jukebox. Evelyn looked at him for the first time that evening. The pattern. The answer confused almost everyone except him. The older man's expression changed. He understood exactly what she meant. Patterns revealed intentions. Small distractions. Missing items. Dead communication lines. Strategic positioning. Individually meaningless. Together they formed a picture. One of the operators slowly stood. How do you know that? He asked. Evelyn's eyes settled on him. Because people rarely hide what they are doing. They hide why they are doing it. The room grew quiet again. The operator felt an unexpected chill. That was not the kind of answer an ordinary person gave. It sounded like something learned through experience. Years of experience. Across the bar, one of the strangers suddenly looked toward Evelyn. The glance lasted only a moment before he looked away. But it was enough. The older man saw it. So did two of the operators. Something had changed. The strangers had finally realized they were being observed. Evelyn remained completely calm. She folded her hands and stood near the counter as though she were simply waiting for another glass of water. No dramatic gestures. No confrontation. No attempt to draw attention. Yet the atmosphere inside the Harbor Line bar had completely transformed. The operators were no longer treating her like a curiosity. They were studying her. One of them leaned toward his teammate and whispered, "She noticed everything before we did." Another nodded slowly. That should not be possible. The older man heard them. It is possible, he said quietly. If you spent enough years doing it. The younger operator looked at him. Doing what? The older man never took his eyes off Evelyn. Reading rooms. Reading people. Reading situations. The operator frowned. Military? The older man hesitated. Maybe. A moment later, one of the strangers headed toward the exit. Another followed shortly after. Then a third. Within 2 minutes, they were gone. No incident. No confrontation. No explanation. They simply disappeared into the rain. Several customers laughed nervously and returned to their conversations. The tension slowly began to dissolve. But the operators were no longer interested in football or drinks. Their attention remained fixed on Evelyn. Finally, one of them approached her again. All right, he said carefully. Who are you? Evelyn smiled faintly. Nobody important. The operator shook his head. I do not believe that anymore. For the first time all night, a different voice answered before Evelyn could speak. The older man stepped forward and looked directly at the operators. His face had gone pale. You should not ask who she is, he said quietly. You should ask where you have seen her before. Every eye turned toward him. Then he looked at Evelyn's silver chain, and the color drained from his face completely. Because he had finally recognized it. The operators looked from the older man to Evelyn and back again. Nobody understood what had just happened, but everyone could feel the weight behind his reaction. The silver chain around Evelyn's neck seemed ordinary. A thin piece of worn metal hanging beneath her collar. Nothing more. Yet the older man stared at it as though he had seen a ghost. That cannot be possible, he murmured. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. It has been a long time. One of the operators stepped forward. What are you talking about? The older man took a slow breath. About 15 years ago, I worked logistics support for a joint training program outside Coronado. The room fell quiet. Even the bartender stopped pretending to clean glasses. There was a small group of instructors that never appeared in photographs. No interviews. No publicity. No official introductions. We were told not to ask questions. He looked directly at Evelyn. Most people never even learned their names. One of the operators frowned. What does that have to do with her? The older man pointed toward the silver chain. That tag. His voice had become almost a whisper. I saw it once before. Evelyn said nothing. The operators exchanged uncertain glances. The older man continued. Back then, people talked about a woman who could walk into a room and notice things that entire teams missed. Not because she was smarter than everyone else. Because she paid attention when everyone else became distracted. One of the younger operators laughed nervously. That sounds like a legend. Most legends start somewhere, the older man replied. Evelyn slowly picked up her glass of water. Her expression remained calm, but she was no longer denying anything. That alone made the operators uneasy. The oldest member of their group leaned forward. What was her job? He asked. The older man shook his head. Nobody ever gave us a clear answer. Instructor? Maybe. Analyst? Maybe. Operator? The older man looked at Evelyn. Definitely. Silence spread across the room again. Outside, rain continued striking the windows. Inside, nobody seemed interested in football anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the woman they had spent the evening teasing. One of the operators suddenly remembered something. Earlier, when she warned the bartender. Earlier, when she noticed the strangers. Earlier, when she chose the seat that gave her a view of every entrance and exit. None of that felt ordinary anymore. Who trained you? He finally asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. A lot of people. Military? Some. Special operations? Evelyn took a sip of water. Some of them. The answer only deepened the mystery. Then the older man spoke again. The story said one thing about that instructor. Everyone turned toward him. What stories? Asked the bartender. The older man swallowed. That the people she trained eventually became some of the best in the country. He looked directly at the operators. And the strangest part is that most of them never knew her real name. For the first time all night, uncertainty appeared on Evelyn's face. Very slight. Barely visible. Yet the older man noticed it immediately. And that was when he became certain of something far more shocking than her military past. The operators thought they were discovering who Evelyn Hart used to be. The truth was much bigger. They were only beginning to realize how many people in that room might already know her without ever understanding why. No one spoke after the older man's last words. The silence felt heavier than the storm outside. The operators looked at one another, each trying to remember something they could not quite reach. A face from a briefing room. A voice from a training range. A lesson repeated years ago. Something familiar lingered just beyond memory. Evelyn seemed to sense what they were thinking. She lowered her glass and offered a small smile. Memory plays tricks on people, she said softly. Especially when enough years pass. One of the operators shook his head. No. I know I have heard something like this before. The older man nodded. You probably have. He leaned against the counter and looked around the room. The instructors nobody remembers are usually the ones who taught the most important lessons. The bartender stared at Evelyn. You trained special operations personnel? Evelyn immediately shook her head. I helped people learn how to observe. That is not a normal answer, one operator replied. Most instructors teach skills. Evelyn looked toward the rain-covered windows. Observation is a skill. Another operator suddenly sat forward. Wait. Everyone turned toward him. His eyes were fixed on Evelyn's silver chain. Several years ago, during a readiness evaluation, our instructor kept repeating the same sentence. The room became quiet again. What sentence? Asked the bartender. The operator swallowed. People reveal their intentions long before they reveal their actions. The older man slowly closed his eyes. Evelyn said nothing. The operator continued. At the time we thought it was just a training phrase. Something to make us pay attention. His voice became quieter. But the instructor who taught it never gave a name. Another operator looked at Evelyn. You used that exact idea tonight. Several heads turned toward her. The connection was impossible to ignore. For the first time all evening, the teasing had completely vanished. Respect had quietly taken its place. Not because anyone had seen a rank. Not because anyone had seen a medal. Because every prediction she made had proven correct. Every detail she noticed had mattered. Every warning had been accurate. The older man let out a slow breath. That is why nobody recognized her. The bartender frowned. What do you mean? Because the people she trained were never supposed to focus on her. They were supposed to focus on the lesson. The operators exchanged stunned looks. The realization spread slowly across the room. The woman they had dismissed as an ordinary customer might have influenced careers, decisions, and training years earlier without any of them ever knowing her identity. Evelyn glanced toward the door. The storm was beginning to weaken. The rain had softened. The night was growing quieter. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. One operator immediately stood. You are leaving? Evelyn nodded. It is getting late. That is it? Another asked. After all this? A faint smile crossed her face. There is not much else to say. But as she turned toward the exit, the oldest operator in the group suddenly froze. His eyes widened. A memory had finally surfaced. And what he remembered was far more shocking than anything they had discussed all night. The oldest operator remained frozen beside the table. Everyone noticed. Evelyn stopped a few feet from the door and slowly turned back. The operator stared at her as if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. The observation course, he said quietly. Nobody understood. He took another step forward. 8 years ago. Desert training facility. No names. No ranks. No introductions. His voice trembled slightly. There was a woman who walked through the entire exercise area and pointed out 23 things our team missed. The room became completely silent. Evelyn did not speak. The operator continued. We thought she was an evaluator. Then we thought she was intelligence staff. Nobody knew for sure. He laughed softly at the memory. At the end of the course she said something. The bartender leaned closer. What did she say? The operator never looked away from Evelyn. She said the most dangerous thing in any room is not the threat you see. It is the assumption that there is no threat at all. The older man closed his eyes and smiled. The sentence sounded familiar because it belonged to the same philosophy that had guided everything Evelyn had done that evening. The operator shook his head in disbelief. That was you. Evelyn offered a small shrug. A long time ago. The answer hit harder than any dramatic revelation could have. There was no boasting. No list of accomplishments. No speech about sacrifice. Just a simple acknowledgement. Around the room, people began replaying the entire evening in their minds. The seat she chose. The details she noticed. The warnings she gave. The calm way she carried herself. Suddenly everything made sense. One of the younger operators looked embarrassed. We spent half the night making jokes. Evelyn smiled kindly. You spent half the night having fun. There is a difference. The answer only deepened their respect. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing scattered reflections of moonlight on the wet pavement. Evelyn slipped on her jacket and moved toward the exit once more. This time nobody tried to stop her. The room simply watched. The bartender finally spoke. Can I ask one last question? Evelyn paused near the door. Sure. After everything you have done, why stay anonymous? For a moment she looked through the glass toward the quiet street beyond. Then she answered. Because the goal was never to be remembered. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Evelyn opened the door. Cool night air drifted inside. Before stepping out, she glanced back one final time. Her eyes settled briefly on the operators. The people who taught me believed something important. One of them nodded. What was that? A faint smile crossed her face. If you do your job correctly, people will remember the lesson long after they forget your name. Then she stepped into the night and disappeared beyond the glow of the streetlights. The door closed behind her. For several seconds nobody said a word. Finally, the oldest operator looked down at his drink and quietly laughed. You know, he said, for someone who claimed to be nobody important, she changed the entire room. And long after Evelyn Hart was gone, nobody in the Harbor Line bar ever forgot the lesson she left behind.